It was a perfectly lovely afternoon in the village of Muchwood Green, the sort of day that seemed curated by a benevolent hand. Skies dappled with just the right amount of cloud, bees bumbling about lazily, and a sun that warmed without wilting. The rectory garden was in full bloom, lilac and roses nodding their scented heads alongside manicured hedges, while bunting fluttered from trellises and the silverware gleamed beneath starched linen cloths. The annual garden charity fete, hosted by the energetic Mrs. Frances Weatherby, was in full swing. At one table, slices of Victoria sponge were vanishing with impressive speed, while another played host to a gentle rivalry between two competing chutneys. The vicar's wife smiled through a headache as she oversaw the tombola stall, and young Timmy Godfrey, still in his school blazer, was attempting to fish a plastic duck out of a paddling pool with a crooked pole. It was all terribly English and terribly peaceful. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively near the rose trellis, quietly sipping a cup of lukewarm Darjeeling. She had long since mastered the art of being both present and invisible. At 85, she had the fragile look of spun sugar and the manners of a bygone era, yet her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She had noted, for instance, that Colonel Brackley's second wife, who had loudly claimed to be on a strict low-sugar regimen, had made 3 visits to the sponge cake table, and that young Fiona Larch, said to be devoted to her fiancé in London, seemed all too delighted by the company of local solicitor James Wickham. But it was the entrance of a late guest that drew the most attention, though no one would say so directly. Mrs. Edwina Drake, dressed in violet silk with a black lace scarf despite the warmth, arrived without fanfare. She was a woman of no obvious means, but carried herself like a duchess, chin lifted, expression carefully neutral. Her presence made the chattering ebb for just a moment before the polite murmurs resumed. She was, after all, the widow who was never married. It was one of those phrases coined by the village in a haze of gossip and contradiction. Mrs. Drake had arrived in Muchwood Green 7 years prior, claiming to be the grieving widow of a naval officer lost at sea. No record of the man, or the marriage, had ever surfaced. But she had money, and style, and a sense of imperviousness that made one wary of prying. She had bought the ivy-covered Rosemere cottage, hired a taciturn gardener, and become an enigma tucked into the village like a rare book on the wrong shelf. Now she approached the table where Miss Marple sat. "How pleasant to see you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but oddly flat. "I do hope the fete has not proved too exhausting." "Oh, not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied kindly. "One is never too old for a nice bit of sponge cake and scandal, I find." Mrs. Drake offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and moved on. The fete drew to a close shortly after 4. A mild breeze sent a few paper napkins skittering across the lawn, and volunteers began dismantling the bunting. By 5, the crowd had dwindled. Miss Marple, ever polite, took her leave and made her way slowly back to her cottage, nodding to Mr. Simpkins, the village postman, who was red-faced and slightly drunk from unexpected cider intake. It wasn't until the next morning that the peace was truly shattered. Edwina Drake was found dead in her drawing room. Poison. A half-drunk glass of elderflower cordial sat by her elbow, and the scent of crushed valerian still lingered faintly in the air. The widow, who was never married, had gone to her grave with secrets intact. But Miss Marple had already begun to see the outlines of a truth no one else could yet imagine. The news of Edwina Drake's death traveled swiftly through Muchwood Green, carried on the wings of whispered conversations and curious glances. It was the sort of event that shattered the village's serene rhythm, like a stone tossed into the still waters of a once placid pond. The villagers found themselves gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones behind lace curtains or over cups of tea, each with their own theory, their own version of what might have happened to the enigmatic widow. At the village post office, Mrs. Olive Benton, who prided herself on knowing everyone's business and little else, was already telling the story with considerable embellishment. Dead, they say, poisoned no less, and in her own home. Can you imagine? Poor Edwina, who never troubled a soul. Or so she wanted us to think. Olive's eyes gleamed with a mixture of horror and excitement. But I heard from the baker's boy that she had visitors late the night before. Strange ones, not the sort we usually see. Down the lane at the White Hart Inn, the landlord wiped his hands on a towel as he listened to a knot of regulars debate the news. Poisoned, eh? Well, that's a sharp twist. I always thought she kept to herself too much. Folks say she had secrets. Who wouldn't? A woman with money and no family, arriving out of nowhere. Mr. Hargrove shrugged, his large frame nearly filling the chair. There's always more to these quiet types than meets the eye. Miss Marple, for her part, moved quietly through the village, aware of the glances and half-smiles that followed her. She stopped briefly outside the post office, catching snippets of conversation that, though tainted with gossip, held kernels of truth. The widow's death was no accident, and the cause was poison, an intimate, deliberate act. That much she understood from the reports of Dr. Clark, the village physician who had been among the first on the scene. Inside Rosemere Cottage, the house where Edwina had lived, the local constable, Sergeant Pritchard, was beginning his formal inquiries. He was a competent officer, but one who preferred straightforward cases. Burglaries, a stray dog here and there, the occasional minor dispute. Murder, especially one so carefully concealed, was a new and unwelcome challenge. The drawing room, where Edwina's body had been found, retained the faint scent of crushed valerian, a detail noted by Dr. Clark. The widow had apparently been fond of herbal remedies, but none could have guessed such a gentle habit would cloak something so deadly. The glass of elderflower cordial remained half full, an innocuous object that now carried a sinister weight. Sergeant Pritchard paced the floor thoughtfully. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, he remarked, glancing at Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly, invited by the vicar. Someone she knew, then. Someone she trusted. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That seems likely. Poison, after all, requires access and opportunity, but also something more, a motive. And that's where it gets murky, the sergeant admitted. Edwina wasn't exactly popular, but she wasn't openly disliked. If anything, people found her odd, reserved, secretive. But no one's come forward with any clear reason to harm her. Sometimes the most innocuous-seeming people hide the deepest secrets, Miss Marple murmured, looking around the room with gentle scrutiny. Her eyes lingered on the well-tended rose bushes visible through the window, then on a small, worn book lying on the side table, a volume of poetry by Wordsworth. The vicar, Reverend Sinclair, stepped forward, adjusting his clerical collar. I suppose the village will be talking at length. This will not pass quietly. On the contrary, Reverend, I expect the talk has already begun, Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. Though in Muchwood Green, talk is often a mask for what people truly think. If we listen closely, we might learn what they dare not say aloud. That afternoon, the village square was thick with murmurs. Mrs. Weatherby, the Fates' hostess, appeared visibly shaken. Edwina was a puzzle, she confided to Miss Marple over the garden gate. I never quite knew what to make of her. But she did make enemies, I suppose. Not open enemies. People here don't like to be confrontational, but still, there were tensions. Such as? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet curiosity. Well, Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice. She was quite insistent about buying the old mill cottage, which was meant for the Larch family. Fiona was terribly upset about losing that chance. And then there's Mr. Wickham. Edwina was said to have lent him a large sum, though no one knows why. Some thought it was a business arrangement, others whispered, well, it's hard to say. Miss Marple absorbed the information with calm interest. The threads were beginning to form a web, a disputed property, a mysterious loan, a circle of villagers who had more than friendly ties with the deceased. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the mill cottage itself. It stood at the edge of the village, a quaint structure with weathered beams and shuttered windows. The Larch family had been long-time residents, but Fiona's recent absence, she was away in London, as everyone knew, added another layer to the mystery. The cottage was locked, but the gardener, a taciturn man named Jenkins, let Miss Marple in after a brief exchange of pleasantries. "I don't much like the way things have turned out," Jenkins said, his voice low. "Miss Drake had plans for this place. Had me repainting and fixing all the windows just last week." "Did anyone else know about these plans?" Miss Marple asked, glancing around the modest interior. "Only her solicitor, Mr. Wickham, I think. But I can't say for sure. She kept things close." Outside, as she stepped back into the waning light, Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander over the village's various players. The proud Mrs. Weatherby, the ambitious Mr. Wickham, the distraught Fiona Larch, the taciturn Jenkins, and the rest. Each had their own angle, their own hidden grievances or desires. That evening, at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing together the day's observations. The police were focusing on the obvious, perhaps Mr. Wickham, desperate for money, or Fiona, angry about losing the mill cottage, or even Mrs. Weatherby, who might have felt overshadowed by Edwina's unexpected presence. But Miss Marple, as always, trusted her instinct more than first impressions. It was the small details, an unusual glance, a hesitance in speech, a carefully chosen phrase that would unravel the mystery. And most intriguing of all was the woman herself, Edwina Drake, the widow who was never married, a puzzle with no apparent edges. Her final thought before retiring was that the truth would not come from what people said, but from what they avoided. The village of Muchwood Green was about to reveal its secrets, and Miss Marple was ready to listen. The morning after the garden fete's grim conclusion, Muchwood Green awoke under a heavy cloud of unease. The news of Edwina Drake's death had spread like wildfire overnight, fueling a restless undercurrent beneath the village's outward calm. The gentle clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps and the low murmur of early risers held a sharp edge of whispered speculation and guarded glances. Miss Marple, as always, rose with the dawn, her mind already turning over the fragments she had gathered. The death was poisoning in the purest sense, deliberate, intimate, and meant to be concealed within the ordinariness of a half-finished glass of cordial. It was a crime that spoke not only of malice but of knowledge of Edwina's habits, her vulnerabilities, and her isolation. She took her usual slow path through the village, stopping briefly to exchange quiet greetings with the baker and the postman, neither of whom seemed inclined to speak of the tragedy at length. At the village shop she found Mrs. Benton, who, despite the morning's early hour, was already holding court among a small circle of listeners. "Such a terrible thing," Mrs. Benton was saying, "and who would have thought? Edwina Drake, with her airs, was always so private. I hear she had a visitor last night, late, and none of us saw who." Miss Marple said nothing but made a mental note to inquire further. Visitors, especially unexpected ones, were a significant lead. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Reverend Sinclair welcomed her with a grave nod. The vicar was a man accustomed to comforting his flock, but found himself unusually shaken. "It is a cruel blow," he admitted quietly. "Poor Edwina, and at such a time of year, too. The village seems unsettled." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and sometimes, Reverend, it is in the very disruption that the truth makes itself known. People reveal themselves in moments of tension, whether they realize it or not." Reverend Sinclair gestured toward a modest sitting room where Sergeant Pritchard was already discussing the case with a few local dignitaries, including Mr. Wickham and Mrs. Weatherby. Their faces bore a mixture of concern and curiosity, but none seemed ready to speak openly about their connection to Edwina Drake. Miss Marple joined the circle quietly, listening as the constable outlined the facts as he understood them, the absence of forced entry, the lack of immediate suspects, the subtlety of the poison. "We're looking at someone with access, someone she trusted enough to allow close," Pritchard said. "But trust, as we know, can be a dangerous thing." Mr. Wickham cleared his throat, adjusting his cravat with a careful hand. "I regret that my business dealings with Mrs. Drake were quite limited." "A loan, yes, but nothing more. And I assured her repayment was forthcoming," Mrs. Weatherby interjected, her voice a touch sharp. "And yet you've been remarkably discreet about those dealings." "The village has heard whispers, Mr. Wickham." Miss Marple watched the flicker of discomfort on his face, noting the subtle tightening around his eyes. As the conversation continued, a knock sounded at the door. A breathless young man entered, Timmy Godfrey clutching a scrap of paper. "Miss Marple, I thought you should see this." She took the note, unfolding it carefully. It was a hastily written message, evidently found among Edwina's papers, addressed to an unknown recipient. "If you think to take what is not yours, beware the cost. The past does not forgive." The handwriting was neat but firm, the tone unmistakably a warning. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. A note like this suggested more than a simple loan or a property dispute. It hinted at a long-standing grudge, perhaps even blackmail. But from whom? And why had Edwina kept it? Later that morning, Miss Marple sought out Fiona Larch, the young woman whose claim to the mill cottage had been thwarted by Edwina's purchase. Fiona was staying with relatives in a nearby village, but had returned to Muchwood Green as news of the death spread. She was found sitting in the small parlour of the village inn, eyes red-rimmed and guarded. When Miss Marple approached, Fiona looked up with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "I'm sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said gently. "Though I understand you were not close." Fiona shook her head. "No, not close, but she took something from me. That cottage was supposed to be my future home. Instead, she appeared out of nowhere and bought it outright." "And did you confront her about this?" "No. Edwina had a way of making you feel small if you tried. I was angry, yes, but I never thought, never dreamed that she would be murdered," Miss Marple finished softly. Fiona nodded. "It's all so confusing. There was a lot I didn't know about her, but some things I wish I had." "What sort of things?" Miss Marple pressed, encouraging without pressing. Fiona hesitated, then whispered. "There were nights when I saw her speaking to someone on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, sometimes looking afraid. And there was a man, older, with a scar on his cheek, who came by the house more than once. She never said who he was. The detail was unexpected. The man with the scar could be a new lead, someone from Edwina's past or present. Miss Marple filed the information carefully, as she had done with so many small pieces of the puzzle. Returning to Rosemere Cottage, Miss Marple examined the drawing-room again, now cleared of the initial flurry of police activity. Her gaze settled on the elderflower cordial glass. It was not an expensive drink, nor particularly distinctive. Yet it was the vessel of poison. Who had known she would drink it that evening? A soft knock at the door startled her. It was Mr. Jenkins, the gardener. He looked hesitant, but compelled to speak. "Miss Marple, I don't know if this will help, but I noticed something odd the other day." Mrs. Drake had a visitor, Mrs. Pettigrew from the village, but she wasn't exactly welcome. They argued, and Mrs. Pettigrew left in quite a hurry. "I thought it strange, Mrs. Pettigrew," Miss Marple repeated. "The widow who lives by the old mill?" "Known for her sharp tongue." Jenkins nodded. "That's the one." "Thank you, Jenkins." That may prove useful. The web was growing more intricate. There was the disputed cottage, the mysterious loan, the cryptic note, the shadowy visitors, and now a quarrel between two widows, each with their own secrets and possible motives. Miss Marple knew the village would not rest until every corner was illuminated. Yet the truth often hid in the shadows between words, in what people wished to forget or deny. And she, with her quiet patience and unwavering gaze, would watch and wait for those cracks to appear. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on the day's discoveries. The village, with its quaint facades and polite smiles, was anything but simple. Beneath the surface lay grudges, fears, and ambitions tangled together like the ivy on Rosemare's walls. Tomorrow would bring new questions and perhaps a clue overlooked by all but one woman quietly unraveling the mystery. The widow, who was never married, had been silenced, but the village's secrets were only beginning to speak. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple set out from the vicarage, the weight of the village's murmurs resting quietly upon her shoulders. The peaceful air of Muchwood Green seemed, at first glance, untouched by the tragedy that had unsettled it so deeply. Yet beneath that calm, the undercurrents of suspicion and unspoken grievances rippled subtly, awaiting only the right touch to reveal their full extent. Miss Marple's first call was to the solicitor, Mr. Wickham. His modest office sat near the village square, a tidy building of faded brick and pale green shutters. She found him already at his desk, papers strewn about, though his eyes lifted immediately with the practiced warmth of a man who dealt with confidences daily. "Miss Marple, I heard you were inquiring after Mrs. Drake," he said, rising to offer a chair. "A terrible shock to us all." "Yes, it is," she replied, settling into the chair. "I understand you managed some of her affairs?" "That's correct," Wickham said. "She engaged me primarily for the purchase of the mill cottage and to advise on some personal matters. I must confess, she was rather secretive, even with me." "Secretive in what sense?" Miss Marple inquired, inclining her head. Wickham hesitated. "Sir, she was cautious with her trust. Not unkind, but reserved. She mentioned concerns about old debts and, oddly, a distant relative, though she never named this person. She was nervous about something, but never confided fully." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A distant relative, you say? Did she indicate where this person might be?" "Only that she feared they might come looking for her. She said it was a matter best left in the past." Wickham sighed. "I advised her to be cautious, but I thought it was simply old family troubles, nothing more." "Did she speak of any threats?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No explicit threats?" "More a general unease." This unease echoed the cryptic note Miss Marple had seen. The past, it seemed, was not as buried as Edwina had wished. After leaving the solicitor's office, Miss Marple took a slow walk toward the village green. The morning was drawing more villagers outside, their faces shadowed with worry and curiosity. She noticed Mrs. Pettigrew standing stiffly by the old oak, arms folded tightly, her eyes scanning the street with an expression of thinly veiled bitterness. Miss Marple approached her with calm assurance. "Mrs. Pettigrew, might I have a word?" The widow's lips pressed into a tight line, but she nodded. "If it will help clear the air. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you had an argument with Mrs. Drake shortly before her death." Mrs. Pettigrew's gaze flickered with a mix of defiance and regret. "We did. I confronted her about the mill cottage. She had no right to buy it, and I told her so. I suspect she was trying to erase the village's history, to impose her own will. Was it only about the property?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Hardly," Mrs. Pettigrew admitted, her voice dropping. "There's more between us than land. Edwina and I, well, we shared a history that not many knew. I won't say more, but she owed me, and I was not the only one." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on Mrs. Pettigrew. Secrets were never solitary. They tangled others in their web. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local inn where Fiona Larch had spent the previous evening. She found the young woman seated alone by the fire, her demeanor softer now, but still marked by shadows of distress. "Fiona," Miss Marple began gently, "I've been thinking about your mention of the man with the scar. Can you tell me more?" Fiona looked down, fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief. I never saw his face clearly, but he came by often, always in the evenings. Edwina was frightened of him. She'd hurried to lock the door after he left. Once I heard her mention Charles in a whispered phone call. Charles? Miss Marple repeated. Yes, but I don't know who he was or what he wanted. She never said this new name was a thread to pull, possibly revealing a figure from Edwina's past who had arrived to disrupt her carefully constructed peace. Miss Marple decided her next visit must be to the local postmistress, Mrs. Tilling, known for her keen eye and habit of noticing even the smallest details. At the post office, amidst the scent of fresh letters and parcels, Mrs. Tilling recalled a peculiar detail. Mrs. Drake had a visitor the evening before she died, she said, leaning in. A gentleman. She thought she knew him well, but he didn't stay long. She seemed unsettled when he left. Did you catch his name? Miss Marple asked. No, but I saw the shape of a scar on his cheek. Mrs. Tilling's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought it was odd. Not a common mark, Miss Marple's thoughts crystallized. The scarred man mentioned by Fiona and the postmistress might well be the same person, a figure from Edwina's shadowed past, returning with unknown intent. Later, as the village settled into the twilight, Miss Marple returned to Rosemere Cottage. She lingered in the garden, noting the arrangement of flowers and shrubs. The rose bushes by the window, freshly pruned, caught her eye. Poisoning often involved proximity, a moment's opportunity. Had the poison been slipped into the cordial at the house, or brought in by someone else? Her gaze fell on the side table where the glass had rested. It was cleaned now, but Miss Marple's mind replayed the scene. The cordial, sweet, harmless, was the perfect disguise. Who had prepared that drink? Who had access to it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Jenkins, the gardener, again. Miss Marple, there's something else. A parcel arrived for Mrs. Drake the day she died. I saw it myself. Wrapped carefully, but no one else noticed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thank you, Jenkins. Might I see it? The gardener led her to the small post room where the parcel had been left. It was modest, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Carefully, Miss Marple untied it and opened the package. Inside lay a small, intricately carved wooden box. She lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old letters bound with a faded ribbon and a delicate locket. The letters were yellowed but bore clear handwriting, formal and precise. Do you know who sent these? Miss Marple asked. No, Jenkins replied. There was no name on the package, only Mrs. Drake's address. The letters were soon to prove a vital clue. Miss Marple recognized a style of writing that spoke of old family affairs, veiled threats, and references to debts not merely financial, but emotional and historical. Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple carefully read through the correspondence by lamplight. The letters revealed a story of a dispute dating back decades, involving a claim to an inheritance and accusations of betrayal within a family long thought broken. Edwina had apparently attempted to reconcile, or at least negotiate, with an estranged relative. The tone grew increasingly tense, ending with a veiled warning that hinted at revenge. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture. The stranger with the scar, possibly this relative, had returned to Muchwood Green. The threats in the letters were no idle words, and Edwina's murder was not a random act, but a calculated move to silence her. Miss Marple sat back, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. The quiet village had revealed its shadowed heart, but there was still much to uncover. The next step would be to confront these new suspicions carefully, to draw out reactions, and to watch closely for the cracks in the polished facades. Tomorrow would bring new questions, and as always, Miss Marple was prepared to listen. Not just to words, but to silences, gestures, and the subtle tells that told a deeper truth. The widow who was never married had left behind more than a mystery. She had left a story waiting to be told, and Miss Marple would tell it with the gentle precision only she possessed. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, with a pale sun casting long shadows over Muchwood Green. The village's usual rhythms were slowly attempting to reassert themselves, though a palpable tension lingered, like a fog that refused to lift. Miss Marple, however, moved through it with quiet purpose, her keen eyes noting the subtle shifts in expression, the hesitations in speech, and the barely concealed glances exchanged behind cupped hands. Her first visit was to the old mill, a crumbling relic set apart from the rest of the village by a thin line of trees and the slow, steady trickle of the river. The mill cottage stood near the water's edge, its stone walls cloaked in ivy, windows shuttered now in the wake of Edwina Drake's death. Miss Marple approached with care, hoping to find someone who might shed light on the mysterious disputes that had simmered beneath the village's placid surface. Mrs. Pettigrew was there, seated on a weathered bench beneath a gnarled apple tree. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her sharp gaze fixed on the river as if the water might somehow wash away the secrets she carried. As Miss Marple drew near, the widow lifted her eyes and gave a slight, almost reluctant nod of greeting. "Mrs. Pettigrew," Miss Marple began gently, "I was hoping we might speak more about your relationship with Mrs. Drake. You mentioned there were matters between you that went beyond the dispute over the mill cottage." Mrs. Pettigrew's lips pressed into a thin line. "Indeed," she said quietly. "We were once close, though few knew it. Not in the way some might think, but we shared a bond forged in difficult times. Edwina was not the woman she appeared to be. Reserved, solitary, yes, but there was a fire beneath her calm. She held on to things, grudges mostly, but also secrets. Dark ones." Miss Marple settled on the bench beside her. "Would you care to share any of those secrets? Perhaps it might help us understand who would wish her harm." The widow's eyes flickered with something like pain. "It was about family, Miss Marple. Long ago, Edwina had a brother. They were estranged for years, but when he died unexpectedly, she became the sole keeper of a legacy she never wanted. There was property, money, but also a scandal, something that could ruin a family name if it ever surfaced." "And the scarred man, do you know who he might be?" Miss Marple asked, her interest piqued. Mrs. Pettigrew nodded slowly. "Charles. His name was Charles Ashford. He was once close to Edwina's brother, business partner, or perhaps something more. After the brother's death, Charles seemed to think he had a claim, too. I believe he came to Muchwood Green with that in mind." Miss Marple's mind spun the threads together. The threatening letters, the mysterious visitor, the family scandal, each a piece of a growing puzzle. With a polite nod, she rose and made her way back into the village, resolving to seek out more about Charles Ashford and the family legacy that seemed to lie at the heart of this deadly game. At the village inn, she encountered Mr. Wickham again, who looked more unsettled than before. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a forced smile. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Drake's files, and I must say the financial entanglements are more complex than I anticipated. There are debts, yes, but also investments and correspondences with parties outside the village. One name keeps appearing. Ashford, Miss Marple repeated. That fits with what I've learned. Do you know where Mr. Ashford might be now?" Wickham shook his head. "No, but I suspect he's nearby." There was talk of a recent visit from a man matching his description, scarred cheek and all. If he's involved, it could explain a great deal. Miss Marple's next move was to visit the local pub, a hub where villagers sometimes let slip more than they intended. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Clark, greeted her warmly but with a knowing look. "Miss Marple, you're stirring up quite a hornet's nest with all this talk of Ashford," she said quietly. "Some folks don't like digging into the past. But I overheard something last night, a late visitor to the village asking after Edwina and the mill cottage. He left in a hurry when asked too many questions. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did you notice anything else unusual? Perhaps what he looked like or where he went? Mrs. Clark's eyes narrowed. He wasn't one for talking, but I did see a scar on his cheek. A man who seems to be trying to find something, or someone. It's no wonder Edwina was frightened. Each new detail tightened the noose of suspicion around Charles Ashford, though Miss Marple was careful not to leap to conclusions. She understood well that in matters of the heart and family, appearances could deceive. That afternoon, she decided to visit the village postmistress once more, seeking the letters and any other correspondence related to Ashford. Mrs. Tilling was happy to assist, carefully sifting through the stacks of letters until she handed over a small bundle. These arrived in the weeks before Mrs. Drake's death, she explained. They're from a Mr. Charles Ashford, or at least signed as such. The tone grows increasingly demanding. Miss Marple read through the letters by the firelight, noting the subtle escalation from polite requests to veiled threats and finally outright demands for money and property. One letter in particular caught her eye. Your silence will be rewarded, Edwina. Your refusal will force my hand. Remember, blood debts must be paid. The threat was unmistakable. As dusk settled over Muchwood Green, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts restless. The widow who was never married had indeed lived a life marked by shadow and conflict, with forces that reached beyond the village's serene facade. And yet, someone here had chosen to end her life rather than face the consequences of secrets revealed. Miss Marple resolved to tread carefully in the coming days. The true culprit would reveal themselves not through force or spectacle, but through the subtle shifts in behavior and the silent language of guilt. In the quiet of her sitting room, she allowed herself a moment's pause, then reached for her notebook. The case was far from closed, and the gentle detective was just beginning to see the faint outline of the truth hidden beneath Muchwood Green's surface. The days that followed slipped by with the slow, measured pace typical of Muchwood Green. But for Miss Marple, every moment was charged with quiet observation and delicate deduction. The village was awash with whispers and half-truths, the kind that fluttered just beneath polite conversation like moths to a flickering flame. Yet Miss Marple, with her customary patience, sifted through the gossip with a deft hand, recognizing that in such small communities, truth was often camouflaged in layers of social niceties and concealed resentments. One crisp morning, she found herself walking toward the rectory once again, where the vicar, Reverend Clement, was tending the small garden outside. He greeted her with a gentle smile, but there was an undercurrent of unease in his eyes. Miss Marple noted it immediately. "Good morning, Reverend. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment," she began, as they settled on a bench beneath the sprawling elm. "Anything to aid your inquiries, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice low but sincere. "I've been reflecting on the tensions that surrounded Mrs. Drake, particularly concerning her family and this Mr. Ashford." "I understand you knew her well?" "Yes, indeed," Reverend Clement said, his gaze drifting momentarily to the distant village street. Edwina was a complicated soul. Private, yes, but deeply conscientious. She often confided in me, though always cautiously. She carried burdens that were invisible to most. Burdens such as? He sighed, folding his hands. She once told me about her brother's death and the scandal that followed. It was a tragedy that fractured their family completely. Edwina took it upon herself to protect the village's reputation and her family's name. She feared that the truth, if revealed, would cause irreparable damage. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Do you recall any mention of Mr. Ashford?" The vicar hesitated. Yes, Charles Ashford was a shadow from that past. I believe Edwina was torn between confronting him and burying the matter. When he reappeared recently, it disturbed her greatly. This confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion. The roots of the tragedy ran deep entwined with old grievances and unresolved debts. Yet if Charles Ashford was the shadow haunting Edwina's final days, why had the authorities not located him? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the village constable, a stout man named Barnaby, approached at that moment, tipping his hat politely. "Miss Marple, Reverend?" "I've been meaning to speak with you both. We've had a report of a stranger seen lurking near the outskirts of the village last night, scar on the cheek from what I'm told." Reverend Clement's eyes narrowed. "That can only be Mr. Ashford." Miss Marple gave the constable a warm smile. "Have you been able to track him further?" Barnaby shook his head. "No, but I'm doubling patrols and asking questions. If he's here, he's clever at keeping out of sight." "Thank you, Constable," Miss Marple said. As he moved off, she turned back to the vicar. "It appears our mystery man is not finished with Muchwood Green yet." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Fiona Larch once more. The young woman was sitting by the window of her small cottage, gazing out at the garden that had become a silent witness to so much sorrow. Miss Marple took a seat beside her, noting the fragile tremor in Fiona's hands. "I thought of you yesterday, Fiona, when I spoke with Mrs. Pettigrew," she began gently. "She mentioned a brother of Mrs. Drake's and a man named Charles Ashford." Fiona's eyes widened. "Yes, I heard that name too. But no one here talks openly about it. It's like a wound we all pretend isn't there." "Did Edwina ever speak to you about her brother or Mr. Ashford?" "Only in whispers," Fiona admitted. "She said Charles was dangerous and that she wanted to protect the village from him. She feared what might happen if he found out she was still here, alive and alone." "Did she say why?" Fiona shook her head. "No, but I believe it was something about a will or inheritance." Edwina said Charles thought he had a right to what she had, and he wasn't willing to wait quietly. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragments. The legacy was more than money. It was about control, about power and fear. The next day, Miss Marple decided to return to the solicitor's office, hoping to uncover more about the financial documents and any legal wrangling involving Edwina Drake. Mr. Wickham greeted her with a tired smile, motioning her to a small, cluttered study where papers lay stacked. "I've been reviewing some older documents," Wickham said, spreading out a collection of wills, letters, and contracts. Edwina's brother's will was complicated. He left everything to her, but there were conditions. Clauses that required her to maintain the family estate and keep certain matters confidential. Such as? Wickham tapped a particular document. A clause about a family scandal, references to an illegitimate child, and debts incurred by Charles Ashford. It appears the brother tried to shield the family from public disgrace. Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes scanning the text. So Charles had a financial and personal motive to challenge Edwina's claim. "Precisely," Wickham nodded, "and from what I gather, he was growing impatient. There were threats, legal letters, and, finally, the demand for payment we found among the correspondence. And this man Charles Ashford, is there any indication of where he might have gone?" "Rumors place him in a nearby town," Wickham said, "but nothing concrete." Edwina kept close tabs on him, or so it seems. As Miss Marple left the office, the pieces of the puzzle felt heavier, more urgent. Someone in Muchwood Green had been willing to kill to protect their interests or to hide a past best forgotten. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple found herself back at Rosemere Cottage, contemplating the garden and the quiet house that had once been Edwina's sanctuary. Jenkins, the gardener, was closing the shed nearby, and she called him over. "Jenkins, have you noticed anything unusual in the days before Mrs. Drake's death? Anyone coming or going at odd hours?" Jenkins scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Now you mention it, Miss Marple. I did see a man lurking near the back fence one evening just before dark. Didn't get a good look, but he had a limp and was carrying a small bag." "A limp, you say?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. That's a detail I hadn't heard. Jenkins nodded. Yes, he seemed hurried, like he didn't want to be seen. This new detail set Miss Marple's thoughts racing. The scarred visitor, now accompanied by a limp and a secret bag, added layers to the mystery. Was this another figure entangled in the web of secrets, or perhaps the key to unmasking the killer? Her mind turned to the letter's veiled threats, the lingering family scandal, and the shadows that stretched long over Muchwood Green. The truth was near, obscured only by the village's reluctance to face its own history. Miss Marple's next steps would be careful, deliberate. To unravel this, she would have to gently pull at the threads, engaging suspects with subtle questions, observing their responses, and waiting for the cracks in their composed facades to appear. For now, as the stars began to pepper the night sky, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. The widow, who was never married, had left behind a story that demanded telling, and she, with all her understanding of human nature and hidden motives, was the only one patient and wise enough to tell it. The game was afoot once more. The days deepened into a soft, lingering autumn as Muchwood Green settled into a fragile routine. Though beneath its genteel surface, a quiet storm continued to swirl. Miss Marple, ever watchful, found her thoughts turning ceaselessly over the small details Jenkins had mentioned: the man with the limp and the mysterious bag, and the steady encroachment of shadows cast by Charles Ashford's threat. She understood well that the truth in such matters was rarely found in a single dramatic act, but rather in the gentle unraveling of human nature's intricate threads. On a blustery afternoon, Miss Marple made her way once again to the village post office, where Mrs. Tilling was sorting through the day's mail. The elderly woman greeted her with a warm smile, though there was a faint trace of concern in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I thought you might like to see this." She held out a letter, its envelope creased and weathered, clearly older than the recent batch. It arrived yesterday, but was misplaced until today. Miss Marple took the letter carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably Edwina Drake's, but the ink was faded and the paper brittle. Reading the letter quietly, Miss Marple's brow furrowed. It was addressed to a "Dearest Charles," written long before the events of the present, and spoke in guarded terms of regret and warning. Edwina implored Charles to reconsider his actions and hinted at a secret that could destroy them both. The letter ended with a chilling line: "If you cannot see reason, then I fear there will be consequences that neither of us can escape." Miss Marple folded the letter with care. The tone was different from the threatening letters Charles had sent recently. This was a plea, one made in fear and perhaps hope. As she stepped outside, the wind tugged at her shawl, and she pondered the complexities of a relationship forged in fear, guilt, and unresolved betrayal. That evening she was invited to the village hall for a gathering ostensibly held to commemorate Mrs. Drake's life. The room was filled with villagers dressed in subdued colors, their faces a mixture of grief, unease, and curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire as eyes flickered to one another, each person silently accusing or defending. Miss Marple watched closely as the villagers mingled, noting how the conversation twisted and turned around the mystery that had gripped them all. She noticed Fiona Larch speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Wickham, the solicitor's brows furrowed in concentration. Across the room, Mrs. Pettigrew sat alone, her hands clenched tightly around a cup of tea, while Jenkins, the gardener, lingered near the doorway, casting wary glances toward the back exit. The village constable, Barnaby, was circulating through the crowd, answering questions with the official calm expected of his role, but with an edge of impatience that suggested frustration with the slow progress of the investigation. During a lull in the gathering, Miss Marple quietly approached Mrs. Pettigrew. "I wonder, Mrs. Pettigrew," she said softly, "if there are any details you might feel comfortable sharing, perhaps about the visitor Jenkins saw or any unusual events leading up to the tragedy." The widow's eyes flickered with hesitation. Then she nodded slowly. There was a man, yes. Not just one, Miss Marple, but two who seemed out of place in our village. The scarred visitor we've all heard of, and another. I saw him once, late at night near the mill. He wore a long coat and moved with a limp, carrying a small bag. Miss Marple's interest deepened. Do you know who he might be? Mrs. Pettigrew's gaze dropped to her teacup. I think it was Robert Larch. The name struck Miss Marple sharply. Robert, Fiona's father, had appeared until now a man of quiet resolve and respectable standing, but this revelation suggested a darker involvement. What might Robert Larch want with Mrs. Drake? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm. The widow shrugged. There's always been talk of old debts and grudges between their families. But no one really knows the full story. The mention of the Larch family added another tangled thread to the web. Miss Marple resolved to speak with Robert Larch directly, and with Fiona as well, knowing that understanding their connections to Edwina Drake might reveal motives hidden beneath layers of civility. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the Larch household, a modest yet well-maintained cottage on the village's edge. She found Robert in the garden, pruning his roses with methodical care. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary but courteous. Mr. Larch, Miss Marple began, I was hoping to ask you a few questions about Mrs. Drake and the days leading up to her death. Robert nodded, setting down his pruning shears. Of course, Miss Marple. I want to help in any way I can. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Mrs. Pettigrew mentioned seeing a man with a limp near the mill. Someone she believes might have been you. Is that correct? Robert's face tightened briefly. Yes, I have a slight limp from an old injury. I went to the mill that evening to speak with Edwina. There were matters between us that needed resolving. What kind of matters? Miss Marple pressed, watching for any flicker of evasion. He sighed, looking away toward the distant trees. It's about debts. Old debts. My family has long owed Edwina's, though the exact nature is complicated. I hoped to come to an agreement before things got out of hand. Miss Marple nodded, sensing the weight of unspoken truths. Did the meeting go well? Robert's eyes darkened. No. Edwina was fearful, suspicious. She accused me of scheming, though I was only trying to save our family's name. We argued, and I left frustrated. Did you see anyone else near the mill that evening? He hesitated. No, just the shadows and the cold wind. Before Miss Marple could ask more, Fiona appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Mother said you wanted to speak with me, she asked, stepping forward. Yes, Fiona, Miss Marple said kindly. I want to understand everything about your family's connections to Mrs. Drake. It might help clear up some questions. Fiona nodded, glancing at her father. There are things I didn't know until recently, she admitted. My father and Edwina had a complicated past, long before I was born. Old grievances, secrets that were buried and then disturbed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Secrets often have a way of resurfacing, especially when money and reputation are involved. Did you or your father ever feel threatened? Fiona swallowed. Sometimes. There were late-night visits, letters that didn't make sense, and an uneasy feeling that someone was watching. I tried to convince my father to go to the police, but he feared it would make things worse. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Fear can be a powerful force, but so can courage. Sometimes telling the truth is the only way to find peace. The conversation lingered on, revealing fissures in the Larch family's carefully maintained facade. Miss Marple felt the threads pull tighter, a web of long-held grudges and secrets that might yet explain the tragedy that had shattered Muchwood Green. As she left the Larch cottage, the autumn wind tugged at her scarf, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. The pieces were falling into place, But one thing was clear. The killer's mask was yet unbroken. Miss Marple resolved that her next steps would be to watch and listen carefully, to engage the suspects in quiet conversation, and to observe their reactions when the past was brought gently to light. For in the world she knew so well, it was not the loud confession or the overt accusation that revealed guilt, but the subtle shifts, an evasive glance, a tightening jaw, the flicker of unease beneath a practiced smile. And Miss Marple was patient enough to wait for those signs to appear. The wind had shifted by the time Miss Marple returned to her quaint, ivy-covered cottage, bringing with it a sharpness that hinted at the approaching winter. The village of Muchwood Green, normally so serene and ordered, seemed to hold its breath in uneasy anticipation, as if sensing the tension threading through its familiar lanes and gardens. Miss Marple felt it too, a stirring beneath the surface of everyday life, like a silent heartbeat that quickened with each passing hour. That evening, as the amber glow of her sitting-room lamp cast soft shadows against the walls lined with well-thumbed books and delicate china, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair. The letter from Edwina Drake, the quiet revelations from Mrs. Pettigrew, and the strained conversation with the Larches, each detail circled in her mind like autumn leaves caught in a gentle eddy. But there was one fragment that insisted on staying just beyond reach. The scarred man Jenkins had described. The limp, the bag. The image lingered stubbornly, as if it held the key to all that had happened. Determined to press further, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Jenkins again. The gardener had been reticent, no doubt wary of the stir caused by Edwina Drake's death, yet Miss Marple's gentle manner often coaxed the truth from even the most guarded souls. The next morning, Miss Marple walked down the lane to the gardener's cottage, nestled near the edge of the village green. Jenkins was tending to a bed of chrysanthemums, his face weathered by years, but keen beneath the creases. "Good morning, Jenkins," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "May I trouble you for a moment? I'd like to hear more about the visitor you saw near the mill." Jenkins straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said cautiously. "It's been hard to speak about it openly, what with the village on edge. But I think it's time he led her to a bench under an old oak tree, where the autumn leaves danced lightly on the breeze." Jenkins's eyes narrowed as he recalled the night. The man came just after dusk. He moved slow, like he was nursing that limp. And that bag he carried looked heavy, maybe full of something he wanted to hide. I'd never seen him before, but there was a scar on his cheek, fresh enough to sting. Miss Marple listened intently. "Did you notice where he went after the mill?" Jenkins shook his head. "No, but there was something else. I heard voices, 2 men arguing nearby. I thought it might be a quarrel between villagers at first, but the words were clipped, secretive. Then the man with the limp left, and I saw another figure slip away into the shadows, someone smaller, more careful." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting needles as the picture grew clearer. 2 men, strangers to the village perhaps, meeting in secret under the cloak of darkness. The mill, an old unused building, became the stage for more than just whispered quarrels. "Did you recognize the second man at all?" she asked softly. Jenkins' gaze flickered. "No, but he didn't have a limp, and he moved with the kind of ease you don't forget." "Like a cat, Miss Marple." A cat-like figure, a scarred man with a limp, secret meetings. It was a tableau of suspicion, yet no one had come forward with any hint of such visitors until now. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the village's quieter residents. It occurred to her that certain people might know more but were too fearful or too loyal to speak openly. Among them was young Anna Bennet, the village school teacher, whose bright eyes had seemed to watch every incident with an intensity that suggested more than mere curiosity. The following afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Anna at the schoolhouse, a tidy brick building with windows framed by climbing ivy. "Miss Bennet," she began as the young woman ushered her inside. "I wondered if you might have noticed anything unusual around the mill or in the village during these past weeks." Anna hesitated, then nodded. "I have, Miss Marple. It's been hard to ignore the odd comings and goings, especially late at night. A few weeks ago, I thought I saw a shadow lurking near the old mill. Someone watching the village from the darkness." "Did you tell anyone?" Miss Marple asked gently. Anna shook her head. "I wasn't sure what I saw. And then there's the matter of Mr. Charles Ashford. People are afraid of him. Some say he has a temper, and others whisper about things best left unspoken. I feared that speaking up might bring trouble." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Fear is often a silencer, but the truth finds a way. Did you notice anything peculiar about Mr. Ashford's behavior recently?" Anna blushed faintly. "He's been more restless than usual. I overheard him on the telephone speaking urgently, his voice low and harsh. It was the kind of call that makes one's skin prickle." The picture deepened. Charles Ashford, with his volatile temper and secretive phone calls, the scarred man with the limp, Jenkins's whispered voices, and the shadows near the mill, all signs that the surface calm of Muchwood Green was an illusion. Miss Marple thanked Anna and walked home, her mind weaving the threads into a pattern only she could see. She realized it was time to speak with Charles Ashford once more, not as a mere visitor, but as a woman quietly testing the waters, seeking to unsettle the careful defenses he had erected. That evening, Miss Marple arrived at Ashford Hall, a stately home on the outskirts of the village, its walls glowing softly in the fading light. Charles greeted her with a measured smile, though his eyes held a flicker of something like challenge. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but edged with impatience, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" She smiled sweetly. "I thought it might be helpful to talk again, Mr. Ashford. There are still so many unanswered questions. The village deserves to know the truth." Charles poured them both a glass of sherry, his movements deliberate. "The truth, Miss Marple, is often more complicated than gossip and rumor. I assure you, I had nothing to do with what happened to Edwina." Miss Marple nodded, unfazed. "Of course. Yet you mentioned to me earlier that you feared something from your past might surface. What exactly do you mean?" He paused, then spoke quietly. "There are old wounds, things I tried to leave behind. But sometimes they have a way of creeping back. I've had to be careful, yes. But I would never harm Edwina. She studied him carefully. Carefulness can be a cloak for secrets, but secrets, like autumn leaves, fall eventually. Perhaps you could help me understand more about your connections to the mill and the visitors Jenkins spoke of." Charles's jaw tightened, but he did not deny the question. "The mill was a place for certain meetings. I won't pretend everything was proper. But I was trying to protect the village and myself from worse consequences." Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, then gently pressed, "Worse consequences? Such as?" He looked away briefly, then back with a hint of bitterness. "People who want power, Miss Marple. People who do not care who they hurt in the process." The weight of his words hung heavily between them. Miss Marple saw in Charles a man caught between desperation and defiance, tangled in the web of Muchwood Green's secrets. As she left Ashford Hall that night, the moon casting pale light over the village, Miss Marple felt the puzzle pieces shifting once more. The scarred man, the limp, the hidden meetings, the old debts and grudges. They were all threads in a fabric worn thin by years of lies and fear. She knew that the next steps must be taken carefully. The trap had to be set with patience, with subtlety, to catch the true face behind the mask. Because in Muchwood Green, beneath the quiet streets and smiling faces, a dangerous game was still being played, and Miss Marple intended to be the one who called checkmate. The villagers gathered around the rose garden, murmurs rippling like the gentle breeze that stirred the petals overhead. Mrs. Adeline Cartwright lay there, eyes closed and face pale as the soft light fading beneath the elm branches. The delicate handkerchief she clutched fluttered slightly, revealing a torn edge, the small piece of embroidered linen catching Miss Marple's eye immediately. She stepped closer, unassuming as the rest of the crowd hovered anxiously, some whispering conjectures while others stood frozen, stunned. Dr. Harold Finch knelt beside Mrs. Cartwright, checking her pulse with practiced calm, but the color in his cheeks betrayed a hint of worry. "She's fainted," he said softly, though Miss Marple noted the tightness in his jaw. "We need to get her inside at once." Two young men carefully lifted the widow, and the crowd parted as they carried her toward the house. The village constable, a stout man named Peters, arrived briskly, his notebook already in hand. "Now then, what happened here?" "Was there any indication of foul play?" he asked, glancing about at the uneasy faces. Thomas Granger, the solicitor, stepped forward, adjusting his glasses nervously. I heard a scream and rushed over. Mrs. Cartwright was standing near the sundial, and then suddenly she collapsed." His eyes flicked toward Evelyn Harper, who shifted awkwardly beside him. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, observed carefully. The solicitor's account was straightforward, but the unease in his manner suggested more than mere surprise. She caught a quick exchange between Mr. Granger and Miss Harper, a glance filled with something close to apprehension, or perhaps guilt. As the guests retreated indoors, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Some said Mrs. Cartwright's collapse might be the result of old age or a sudden illness, while others quietly speculated darker possibilities. It was not like St. Mary Mead to have anything worse than a lost dog or a misplaced teacup disrupt their peaceful routines. Yet Miss Marple, with her ever-watchful eyes, suspected the truth would be more tangled. Later, in the cozy parlor of Elmwood Manor, Mrs. Cartwright rested on a fainting couch, her breathing steady, but her face still pale. Miss Marple sat nearby, quietly knitting, listening to the hushed conversations swirling around her. The widow's doctor, Harold Finch, had retired to fetch some medicine, and the solicitor remained, restless and agitated. "It was terribly sudden," Mr. Granger said, wringing his hands. "Adeline was in good health, as far as I know. Nothing that should have caused such a collapse." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Sometimes, Mr. Granger, the heart carries burdens invisible to others." Her voice was soft, yet there was a subtle weight to her words that caught his attention. Evelyn Harper entered quietly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I hope Mrs. Cartwright will be all right," she murmured, casting a quick glance toward the doorway as if she feared being overheard. "Time will tell," Miss Marple replied, "though I find it curious that the piece of embroidery she clutched was torn. Do you know anything about it?" The room fell silent. Mr. Granger cleared his throat. "It's from an old family heirloom. Adeline's, I believe, but I'm not sure why it would be torn." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly beneath her soft brow. "Sometimes a small detail like that can reveal a great deal." She sipped her tea and glanced around the room, noticing the slight stiffness in the posture of several guests, the forced cheer in their eyes. Outside, the village street had grown quieter, as if the shock had momentarily stilled the usual bustle. Miss Marple excused herself and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp air. She watched the sun lower behind the rolling hills, shadows lengthening across the gardens. Her mind was already piecing together fragments, what had been said, what had been left unsaid. Mrs. Cartwright was no ordinary widow, and this was no ordinary fainting spell. The embroidery's torn edge nagged at her, a silent clue waiting to be understood. That evening, the local police began their official inquiries. Constable Peters questioned several villagers in turn, collecting statements and noting discrepancies. The doctor confirmed that Mrs. Cartwright's collapse was likely due to shock, but no poison or obvious external cause was found. Yet Miss Marple sensed the doctor's quiet tension remained. She knew him well enough to understand that his calm exterior masked a troubled conscience. The next morning brought new developments. Mrs. Cartwright, though still weak, had regained enough strength to speak. Miss Marple visited her quietly, sitting beside the bed and gently broaching the subject. "Adeline, my dear, I wonder if you can tell me anything about the events in the garden yesterday. Anything at all that might have upset you?" The widow's eyes flickered with a distant sadness. "It was nothing, really," she whispered. "Only old memories, and some things I thought long buried." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging gently. "Sometimes those old memories have a way of catching up with us." Before Mrs. Cartwright could respond, the door creaked open and Thomas Granger entered. His face was pale. "There's been a discovery at the manor," he said hurriedly. "A letter, hidden in the library." Miss Marple's interest piqued immediately. "A letter? From whom?" Mr. Granger hesitated. "It's unsigned, but it suggests that someone here is not who they claim to be." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten on her lap as she stood and followed the solicitor to the library. There, among shelves lined with dusty volumes, lay a single envelope, aged and yellowed. Inside was a letter, its words folded carefully and penned in a neat, deliberate hand. "To those who believe the past can be buried forever, beware. Some debts are never forgotten, and some wounds never heal." Miss Marple examined the letter closely, noting the subtle flourishes of the handwriting and the faint scent of lavender on the paper. "Curious," she murmured. "Lavender, perhaps from the garden, or a message meant to unsettle." Mr. Granger's eyes darted nervously. "Who would want to send such a threat?" "Someone who knows Mrs. Cartwright's past," Miss Marple replied softly, her thoughts already weaving the threads tighter. "And someone who believes that past holds power." The day wore on with mounting tension. Miss Marple visited several villagers discreetly, gathering fragments of conversations, observing nervous habits and subtle slips. She noted that Evelyn Harper, usually composed, avoided her gaze. Harold Finch grew increasingly evasive when questioned about his recent visits to Elmwood Manor. Each revelation seemed to cast new shadows rather than dispel old ones. That evening, as twilight deepened, a sudden knock startled Miss Marple at her own cottage door. It was Mr. Granger, looking pale and flustered. "There's been another incident," he whispered. "A theft. Mrs. Cartwright's locket has gone missing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "A theft? Or a warning?" They returned swiftly to Elmwood Manor, where the household was in mild disarray. The absence of the locket, a simple silver piece with a small, intricate clasp, felt more significant than mere loss. It was a symbol, a key perhaps, to the mystery unfolding. Miss Marple stood quietly in the hallway, watching as the villagers reacted with surprise, suspicion, and barely concealed relief, some even with a flicker of triumph. For in a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets were currency, and every slight unearthed altered the balance. In the days that followed, Miss Marple began her final test. She arranged casual encounters with each suspect, slipping in questions with the ease of one who speaks only of the weather, yet listens to the heartbeat beneath. Her sharp observations captured subtle reactions. A twitch, a hesitation, a flicker of anger disguised as amusement. She spoke with Evelyn Harper, commenting on the garden's lavender, noting the faint stain on the schoolteacher's glove. To Dr. Finch, she mentioned the odd timing of his appointments, watching his expression closely. To Mr. Granger, she hinted at the letter's wording, gauging his response. Each conversation was a thread in a delicate web, designed to draw out the truth. Miss Marple's calm exterior masked a mind racing quietly toward resolution. The torn embroidery, the threatening letter, the missing locket, all pieces of a puzzle constructed from human fears, resentments, and hidden histories. One evening, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting on the strange case of the widow who was never married. She knew the final act was near, that the true story lay buried beneath layers of deception, and she was ready to unveil it all with the gentle but unyielding clarity only she could bring. For in St. Mary Mead, where appearances deceived and secrets festered beneath calm surfaces, Miss Marple's quiet wisdom would shine a light on the darkest shadows and reveal the murderer hiding in plain sight. The next morning dawned grey and damp, with a mist curling low over the hedgerows and the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, seated by her kitchen window with a steaming cup of tea in hand, watched as the village stirred to life. Yet beneath the gentle rhythms of daily routine, the tension of the past days lingered like a thick fog. Elmwood Manor had grown quiet since the theft of Mrs. Cartwright's locket, and whispers followed every step taken by its inhabitants. Miss Marple felt the familiar tug of urgency. The puzzle pieces were close to fitting together, but the final picture remained blurred. She resolved to visit Elmwood Manor once more, seeking answers not only in words, but in the silences between them. As she approached the grand house, its ivy-clad facade looked less inviting than before, shadows pooling beneath the tall windows. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, weighted with suspicion and unspoken fears. Mrs. Cartwright, pale but steadier, sat by the drawing-room fire, her gaze distant and guarded. "Good morning, Adeline," Miss Marple greeted gently, settling into a nearby armchair. "How are you feeling today?" The widow's eyes met hers briefly. "Stronger, thank you, but unsettled, as you might expect. This business, it has stirred up things best left alone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it is precisely those things which must be faced if we are to find peace." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Harold Finch, the village doctor. His expression was grave, and there was a tightness about his mouth that Miss Marple had noticed before. "I thought it best to see Mrs. Cartwright myself," he said, glancing at the widow. "Her condition is stable, but the shock has taken its toll." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "Thank you, Doctor. I'm sure your care is much appreciated." When Finch withdrew, Thomas Granger appeared, carrying a small bundle of papers. "Miss Marple, I found something you might want to see," he said, unfolding a set of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These were among Mrs. Cartwright's possessions. They may shed light on the letter found in the library." Carefully, Miss Marple read through the correspondence. They were letters from decades past, written between two people, one unsigned but with hints suggesting a relationship fraught with secrecy and regret. There was talk of betrayal, lost fortunes, and a promise never to return. Most striking was a letter referencing a debt unpaid and the intention to seek justice, no matter the cost. Miss Marple folded the letters with care, her mind piecing together the narrative they hinted at. "It seems that the past Mrs. Cartwright wished buried has a way of resurfacing," she murmured. Granger's face tightened. But who would send the threatening letter now? And why steal the locket? It seems symbolic, yet its meaning eludes me. Before Miss Marple could respond, Evelyn Harper entered, her usual composure replaced by visible distress. "I heard about the locket," she said softly. "It must be returned." "It holds memories far too precious to lose." Miss Marple studied her, noting the way her hands trembled slightly. "Memories can be powerful, Miss Harper, especially when they bind us to the past." Evelyn nodded, her gaze falling. "More powerful than we sometimes admit." Later, as the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple took a solitary stroll through the village. She found herself wandering toward the small chapel at the edge of the parish, a place she had often found useful for quiet reflection. The scent of damp earth and blooming foxgloves filled the air. She paused by the churchyard wall, where a weathered tombstone caught her eye. The inscription was worn, but legible. Eleanor Cartwright, 1872 to 1945. Beneath it, a smaller stone, newly placed, bore the name Adeline Cartwright. Her thoughts returned to the torn embroidery piece Mrs. Cartwright had clutched the day she collapsed. She had studied it again that morning, an intricate pattern stitched carefully, yet marred by a ragged tear near a small insignia. Miss Marple realized that the insignia matched the design embroidered on the locket, the piece now missing. Returning to Elmwood Manor, she called together the remaining key figures: the widow, the solicitor, the school teacher, and the doctor, in the drawing room. The atmosphere was charged with quiet apprehension. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but unwavering, "we have all been touched by events that unsettle the calm of St. Mary Mead. But beneath this surface turmoil lies a story of long-held secrets, of debts unpaid and promises broken." She held up the torn piece of embroidery. Mrs. Cartwright's collapse was no mere fainting spell. It was the shock of a reminder, a fragment of the past returned to haunt. Her turning to Evelyn Harper, she said, "Miss Harper, you once mentioned memories. Could you explain why this locket is so important?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "It belonged to my grandmother, who was very close to Mrs. Cartwright." "It's more than jewelry. It is a symbol of family and trust," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, it was stolen. Someone here sought to unsettle Mrs. Cartwright, to remind her that the past cannot be ignored." Her gaze shifted to Harold Finch. "Doctor, you have been seen making frequent visits to Elmwood Manor. Might there be more to your involvement?" Dr. Finch looked uncomfortable but met her steady gaze. "I visited to check on Mrs. Cartwright's health, nothing more. But I confess, I have my own reasons for concern. There are matters from the past, linked to this family, that weigh heavily on me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Indeed. We all carry shadows, do we not?" She then addressed Thomas Granger. "Mr. Granger, you found those letters that suggest a promise of justice. How well do you know Mrs. Cartwright's history?" Granger hesitated. "Only as much as anyone in the village might. But these letters hint at a betrayal that goes deeper than anyone imagined." Miss Marple allowed a pause before speaking again. "I believe the letter found in the library and the theft of the locket were orchestrated by someone desperate to revive old wounds and protect a secret." She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet garden bathed in the soft glow of evening. The torn embroidery, the threatening letter, the missing locket, they form a chain. But the link that binds them is not the past itself, but how that past touches the present. Turning back, she fixed each person with a calm, searching look. Only one among us had the knowledge, the motive, and the means to execute such a plan. The room was silent, tension thick as the fading light. Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Cartwright's health and memory may have faltered, but her mind remains sharp. The person who sought to break her spirit underestimated the resilience of a woman who has faced hardship before." Her gaze settled finally on Evelyn Harper. "Miss Harper, your gloves bore traces of lavender, the scent on the threatening letter. You avoided my questions, yet you spoke of memories with a tremor. Tell me, why did you come to Elmwood Manor that afternoon, just before Mrs. Cartwright collapsed?" Evelyn's composure cracked. "I went to ask her to reconsider a family matter. There is a truth about my grandmother, about her and Mrs. Cartwright, that I could no longer keep hidden." "And what is that truth?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Evelyn's voice faltered. Years ago, there was a disagreement between our families, a secret kept by Mrs. Cartwright, one that could have changed everything. I believed confronting her might bring resolution, but I feared what I might find. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if pieces clicked into place. Confrontation can stir old wounds, Miss Harper. But when those wounds are hidden, they fester in silence. She turned to Dr. Finch. And you, Doctor, why the frequent visits? I sought to protect Mrs. Cartwright, Finch confessed. I knew of the family tensions and hoped to shield her from harm. And yet, protection can sometimes come too late, Miss Marple said quietly. She looked around the room one last time. This case was never about the surface calm of St. Mary Mead. It was about human nature, the fears, regrets, and passions that lie beneath. And in the end, it is not a stranger, but someone close who wields the sharpest knife. The air seemed to still, the villagers holding their breath as Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes reflecting a quiet certainty. The widow, who was never married, she murmured, was never alone. And now, her secrets have found their voice. The truth, long buried, was finally ready to be revealed. The evening air hung heavy in the drawing-room of Elmwood Manor as the assembled villagers awaited Miss Marple's concluding words. The flickering firelight cast long shadows over their faces, each marked with apprehension, guilt, or hope. Miss Marple, seated calmly in her chair, regarded them all with the gentle sharpness that had long been her signature. "My dear friends," she began softly, "we have journeyed together through a maze of secrets and half-truths, following the delicate trail of torn embroidery, stolen tokens, and whispered threats. It has been a path tangled by fear, sorrow, and a determination to protect what some believed best left hidden." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Mrs. Cartwright's collapse was the outward sign of an inward shock, brought on by the sudden return of reminders from a past she had long struggled to keep buried. The torn embroidery, you see, was no accident. It was a fragment torn in a moment of distress, revealing a connection to a very particular emblem, the same found on the stolen locket. Her gaze swept across the faces before her. The threatening letter, scented faintly with lavender, was a carefully crafted message intended to rattle Mrs. Cartwright and force her to confront a debt of long ago. But the real purpose behind these acts was far more personal. Someone here sought to control the narrative, to hide a truth that, if exposed, would unravel reputations and family ties alike. Turning gently to Evelyn Harper, Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Miss Harper, your visit to Elmwood Manor was the catalyst, though not the cause. You came seeking answers about your grandmother's relationship with Mrs. Cartwright and the secret that divided their families." Evelyn nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only wanted the truth." Miss Marple's expression did not change as she addressed the others. But the person who acted to silence that truth, who sent the threatening letter, stole the locket, and caused the widow's collapse, did so out of fear and desperation. Her eyes fixed finally on Thomas Granger. "Mr. Granger, the letters you discovered reveal more than a century-old promise of justice. They also reveal that your own family was intimately connected to Mrs. Cartwright's past, perhaps more than anyone suspected." A flicker of color rose in the solicitor's cheeks, and he shifted uneasily. "Your desire to protect your family's name," Miss Marple continued, "led you to take matters into your own hands. The theft of the locket was meant to unsettle Mrs. Cartwright, to keep her silent, and when she confronted you with that small, torn piece of embroidery, the last tangible link to a secret she had carried, you panicked." Thomas Granger's face tightened as the understanding dawned. "No, I did not mean to cause harm." "Yet harm was caused," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Mrs. Cartwright's collapse was no accident, though no violence was intended." The shock overwhelmed her. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire, Fear of scandal, the weight of long-buried grievances, and the desperate need to control a fragile peace. "These are the true villains here," Miss Marple said, folding her hands neatly. And in the end, it was a battle fought not with weapons, but with secrets and silence. The solicitor lowered his gaze, the burden of truth finally released. As the tension eased, Mrs. Cartwright, regaining some of her strength, spoke softly. "I've carried my secrets for too long. Perhaps now, with the truth out, I can finally find peace." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Peace often comes when we face our past, not hide from it." Outside, the night had deepened, and the village of St. Mary Mead settled once again into its quiet rhythm. But beneath that stillness, a lesson lingered, that beneath the gentlest of exteriors, human hearts often carry the heaviest of burdens. Miss Marple, ever composed and serene, gathered her things to leave. As she stepped into the cool night air, she reflected that in the delicate art of understanding human nature, the smallest clues often tell the largest truths. And so, with secrets laid bare and justice gently served, the widow, who was never married, found at last the ending she had long deserved, and St. Mary Mead returned to its peaceful, watchful slumber.